When researchers walked into a Romanian orphanage in the year 2000, they expected crying. Rows of babies, hundreds of them, left in cribs with minimal food, no toys, no warmth, no one to hold them. They expected chaos. They expected noise. What they found instead was silence, not the peaceful silence of sleeping children. The silence of babies who had already learned something that no baby should ever have to learn, that crying doesn't work, that no one is coming, that their voice, the only tool they were born with, had been spent and the world had not responded. That silence, researchers would later say, was one of the most disturbing things they had ever witnessed. And what they found when they scanned those babies' brains would change the way science understands love forever. In 1989, the communist dictator of Romania, Nicolae Ceausescu, was overthrown. And when the world looked inside his country, it found something hidden for decades. Over 170,000 children living in state-run institutions, orphanages, hundreds of thousands of children who had been surrendered by families who simply couldn't afford to feed them, under a regime that had simultaneously demanded more births and destroyed the economy. The conditions in these institutions were devastating. Babies were fed on a schedule, diapered on a schedule, bathed on a schedule. They were never rocked, never sung to, rarely spoken to. There were so few staff members for so many children that a single caregiver might be responsible for 20 or more infants at once. There simply wasn't time to hold a baby just because it was crying. There wasn't time to meet a gaze, to smile back, to play, so the babies stopped asking. In 2000, a team of researchers from Harvard, the University of Maryland, and Tulane University launched what would become the most important study on early human deprivation ever conducted. It was called the Bucharest Early Intervention Project. They enrolled 136 children who had been living in these institutions since birth, some just a few months old, some nearly 3 years old. They randomly assigned half of them to be placed with Romanian foster families. The other half stayed in institutional care, and then, for the next 22 years, they watched. What they found would fundamentally rewrite what science knows about the human brain and what love actually is. Here is something most parents are never told. A baby's brain is not born complete. At birth, the human brain has roughly 100 billion neurons, essentially the full adult count, but those neurons are barely connected to each other. The architecture of the brain, the actual wiring that makes us who we are, our ability to think, feel, regulate emotion, form relationships, make decisions, read a face, feel safe, all of it is built after birth, and it is built almost entirely through experience. In the first few years of life, the brain forms up to 1 million new neural connections every single second. 1 million per second, and those connections are not random. They are shaped in overwhelming proportion by one thing, the responsiveness of the people around the baby. Neuroscientists at Harvard call it serve and return. When a baby makes a sound, reaches out, makes eye contact, turns its head, babbles at you, that is a serve. And when you respond, when you look back, when you say something, when you smile, when you reach for them, that is a return. And in that exchange, in that millisecond of back and forth, a neural pathway is built. A connection is laid down. The brain adds a strand to its architecture. Now multiply that across thousands of interactions a day, across weeks, across months, across a year. A baby with attentive parents is firing and wiring their brain constantly. In the crib, during feeding, during a diaper change, at 3 a.m. when you're barely awake and you lean over anyway. Every single response is a brick in the architecture of a human mind. But what happens when no one returns the serve? In those Romanian institutions, a baby might babble and receive nothing. Cry and receive nothing. Reach up and meet only air. Not once, not twice. Thousands of times, every single day, for months, the serves went unanswered. And so the connections, the ones that would have been built in those moments, were never formed. The brain was building itself in the dark. When the Bucharest researchers eventually placed these children in brain scanners, they were not entirely surprised by what they found, but they were stunned by the scale of it. The brains of children who had been raised in institutions were measurably, visibly, structurally smaller than the brains of children raised in families. Not metaphorically smaller. Physically smaller, reduced total brain volume, visible on MRI scans, documented in peer-reviewed journals, confirmed across multiple independent research teams in multiple countries. 2 specific types of brain tissue were affected. Gray matter, the cellular tissue responsible for processing information, regulating the nervous system, enabling cognition and emotional control, was reduced. And white matter, the fiber pathways that connect different brain regions to each other, the wiring through which the brain communicates with itself, was also reduced. Two separate systems, both diminished. The brain wasn't just smaller, it was less connected. But the finding that may have surprised researchers most came from the prefrontal cortex, the region that sits just behind the forehead and governs some of the most distinctly human capabilities: planning, self-control, decision-making, empathy, the ability to regulate emotions, to inhibit impulses, to think before acting. In children raised in families, the prefrontal cortex is gradually pruned through childhood and adolescence. Excess connections are trimmed away, the circuitry becomes more efficient, the processing becomes faster and more precise. It's a biological refinement that transforms a reactive infant brain into a thoughtful adult one. In institutionalized children, that pruning hadn't happened properly. Their prefrontal cortices were actually thicker, not as a sign of richness, but as a sign of disorganization. The brain hadn't received the social input it needed to know which connections were worth keeping and which to let go. When those same children were scanned again at age 16, the difference was still there. The brain had kept its architectural confusion all the way from infancy into young adulthood. This is where it gets deeply important because the prefrontal cortex is the last region of the brain to fully develop. It is also the region most dependent on the quality of early experience. Damage there doesn't just affect the first years of life. It follows a child through school, through adolescence, through adulthood, through every relationship they will ever have. Most people assume that a neglected baby must be flooded with stress hormones, that their cortisol, the body's primary stress signal, must be surging, that their nervous system must be in constant alarm. The reality is far more disturbing. Researchers measuring cortisol in institutionalized infants found something unexpected. Their levels weren't high. They were low, flat, blunted. A normal cortisol pattern in a baby peaks in the morning and gradually decreases through the day. It's the biological rhythm of alert, then rest, engagement, then recovery. But babies raised in chronic neglect had lost that rhythm entirely. Their cortisol levels were low in the morning, stayed low all day, and barely responded even to genuinely stressful situations. What does that mean? It means that the stress system had, in a very real biological sense, given up. When stress is chronic and unrelieved, when a baby cries and nothing happens again and again, day after day, the body doesn't just stay on alarm indefinitely. Eventually, the system adapts. It stops signaling. It learns at the level of hormones and neurons that the distress call is useless. And so it quiets. The babies who stopped crying weren't calm. They were, in a neurobiological sense, in a state of learned helplessness so deep that even their bodies had stopped registering distress. Philip Fisher, a researcher at the University of Oregon, found that this blunted cortisol pattern was not associated with physical abuse. It was specifically, consistently, exclusively associated with one thing: neglect, with the absence of a responsive caregiver. The body, it turns out, is not most damaged by what is done to it. It is most damaged by what is withheld from it. And this matters for the long term in ways that are still being uncovered. Abnormal cortisol rhythms have been linked to anxiety, depression, PTSD, mood disorders, and behavior problems. Not as temporary symptoms, as persistent physiological signatures that can last decades. The same children who had flat cortisol as babies were still showing dysregulated stress responses as teenagers and adults. Their bodies never fully forgot the lesson that crying is useless, that asking for help doesn't work, that the world does not respond. Deep inside the brain sits a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. It is, in basic terms, the brain's alarm system, the neural hub that processes emotional significance, that scans the environment for threat, and perhaps most importantly, that distinguishes between the people who are safe and the people who are not. In children raised with a primary caregiver, the amygdala learns to do something remarkable. It responds differently to a familiar face than to a stranger's. When a baby sees its mother, its amygdala fires one way. When it sees someone it doesn't know, it fires differently. That discrimination is not just social recognition. It is the biological foundation of attachment. It is how the brain knows who to run to, who to trust, who to draw close when the world feels frightening. In children raised in institutions, that discrimination was gone. Researchers used fMRI scans to show that post-institutionalized children's amygdalas responded nearly identically to their mother's face as to the face of a complete stranger. The alarm system had no calibration. Every face was, in a neural sense, equally unknown. This is the neuroscience behind one of the most misunderstood behaviors ever observed in orphan children: indiscriminate friendliness. These children will run up to a stranger in a park, throw their arms around them, snuggle in as if they've known this person forever. For years, it was interpreted as warmth, as a sign of resilience even. Researchers at the time called it disarming, but it isn't warmth. It is a broken threat detection system. It is a brain that never learned to distinguish safety from danger because there was never a consistent source of safety to anchor itself to. When there is no one person who is reliably and consistently safe, the brain doesn't learn the concept of safe at all. Everyone becomes equally unknown. And the child who appears to love everyone may, in the neurological truth of it, actually feel connected to no one. Megan Gunner, a researcher at the University of Minnesota who tracked thousands of children adopted from overseas institutions, found that this indiscriminate behavior often doesn't disappear even after adoption, even after years of loving care. What's interesting, she said, is it just doesn't go away. The amygdala, shaped in infancy, carries its confusion forward, and this is where it gets unsettling, because what the amygdala learns in the first year of life doesn't just affect how a baby recognizes faces, it shapes how a person will navigate every relationship for the rest of their life. Here's the finding from the Bucharest study that keeps researchers up at night. It isn't that early deprivation damages the brain. By now, that is proven beyond any reasonable doubt. The finding that carries the real weight, the one with the sharpest implications, is this: the younger a child is when they leave the institution, the more of their brain they save, and there appears to be a threshold, a window, a line after which certain forms of recovery become dramatically, perhaps permanently harder. That line is approximately 2 years of age. Children who were moved from Romanian institutions into foster families before their second birthday showed remarkable improvements. Their language caught up, their IQ rose, their social-emotional functioning improved, their EEG brain activity, the electrical patterns that had been abnormal in institutional children, normalized. When those children were tested at age 8, their brain electrical activity was indistinguishable from children who had never been institutionalized at all. But children who remained in institutions past the age of 2 showed a different picture. Many still improved after being placed in foster care. The human brain is never without some plasticity, even years later. But the improvements were smaller, less complete, and critically, one type of brain tissue, gray matter, did not recover, regardless of how loving and stable the subsequent environment was. Gray matter volume stayed reduced, even in children who went on to be adopted into caring families, even in children who made enormous gains in language and behavior. The structural deficit persisted, associated with elevated risk of ADHD symptoms, with deficits in executive function, with impaired emotional regulation. The window does not close with a slam, it narrows. And through the narrowing gap, less and less of the brain's full potential can be retrieved. Charles Nelson, one of the lead researchers on the Bucharest project, described the implication plainly. If we want children who grow up in deprived environments to recover, they need to be removed from those environments at a very young age. Not young as in school age, not young as in toddlerhood, young as in before the second birthday, before the window narrows past the point of full return. The brain is not infinitely forgiving. It is generous and it is plastic, and it is astonishing in its capacity to adapt and recover, but it has a schedule, and the schedule begins at birth. The English and Romanian adoptees study tracked 165 children adopted from Romanian institutions for 30 years. Not just through childhood, not just through adolescence, but into full adulthood. It is one of the longest and most rigorous follow-up studies of its kind. And its findings paint a complicated, heartbreaking, and sometimes quietly hopeful picture. 4 major outcomes emerged in those who had been most severely deprived: cognitive impairment, ADHD, elevated symptoms resembling autism, and a condition called disinhibited social engagement disorder. That same inability to distinguish safe from unsafe people. The amygdala confusion that persists through decades of life. Cognitive impairment showed genuine recovery over time, particularly in children who had been adopted and who received stable, enriched environments. By adulthood, many of those early cognitive deficits had substantially narrowed. That part of the story carries real hope. ADHD did not recover, it persisted. For some, it worsened through adolescence and into adulthood. The attention and impulse control deficits that were seated in the institutional crib didn't fade with time or support. They became part of the person's neurological identity, an echo of a first year spent without the serve and return exchanges that build the prefrontal cortex into a system capable of self-regulation. But perhaps the most quietly devastating finding came from the interviews conducted with these adoptees in adulthood. When researchers asked what their daily lives looked like, many described persistent struggles with social relationships, difficulty reading others, difficulty knowing who to trust, difficulty navigating the invisible rules of human connection that most people absorb naturally in infancy. A small but significant proportion, roughly 1 in 5, described difficulties in providing adequate parenting to their own children. The wound had traveled, not necessarily because these adults were unloving, not because they hadn't tried, but because some of what we need in order to parent intuitively, the capacity for regulated attunement, the ability to tolerate a child's distress without feeling overwhelmed, the sense that responding to a cry is safe and worthwhile, is laid down in the first year of our own life. And for those who spent that year in an institution, some of that foundation was never built. This is not a story of inevitability. Many of these adults were warm, resilient, motivated, and deeply proud of their families. The human spirit is remarkable in its capacity to build something meaningful out of a broken beginning. But the science is also clear. What happens in the first year of life is not a footnote. It is the prologue to everything. You may never have been inside a Romanian orphanage. You may never have experienced anything approaching that level of deprivation. And if you're watching this, the children in your life almost certainly haven't. But there is something this research is telling all of us, something that extends far beyond institutional walls. The brain of a baby is not waiting for a special curriculum. It is not waiting for the right toy, or the educational program, or the perfectly structured environment. It is waiting every hour of every day in the first year of life for a response. When you talk to a baby who cannot yet understand your words, you are building the language architecture of their brain. When you look back at a baby who looks up at you, you are calibrating their amygdala, teaching it that this face is safe, that safety is a real thing, that the world responds. When you get up at 3 a.m. and lean over the crib and let them know you are there, you are building the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that will one day allow them to think before they act, to regulate their emotions, to empathize with another human being. The Bucharest children were not deprived of wealth. They were not deprived of food alone or shelter alone. They were deprived of exactly one thing at its most fundamental: reliable, responsive human presence. And what those brain scans showed, those smaller volumes, those thicker cortices, those blunted cortisol rhythms, those amygdalas that couldn't tell friend from stranger, was not the damage of cruelty. It was the damage of absence. A baby's brain is the most extraordinary biological construction in the known universe. In the first year of life, it is forming at a speed and scale that will never be matched again. And almost all of it, the architecture of thought, the circuitry of emotion, the wiring of connection, is built through one mechanism: being answered. So the next time you respond to the cry, the next time you lean in, the next time you say something to a baby who stares back at you without yet having the words to reply, know this: you are not doing something small. You are doing something that science now has the tools to measure, the scans to see, and the evidence to confirm. You are building a brain, one answer at a time. If this changed the way you see what's happening inside your baby's mind, the playlist is right there. And every single video goes just as deep, just as far into the hidden science of how a human life is built. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And if this moved you, hit like, because that's how this research finds the parents who need it most. This is Baby Mind Decoded. We're just getting started.